Tom, reparations. We began by talking about disparate impact, the idea that discrimination is so deeply embedded in the American experience that it can take place even in the absence of an intention to discriminate. So this argument, which is that there's some basic flaw or sin that's still with us, comes up in the case for reparations. Longish quotation, but it sets something up. But from Ta-Nehisi Coates in an article in The Atlantic entitled "The Case for Reparations." White supremacy is not merely the work of hot-headed demagogues, but a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. And so we must imagine a new country. Reparations is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. The wealth gap merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say, that American prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal, close quote. And Tom Sowell makes what of that?
Well, it tells me that I've made the right decision not to read The Atlantic for decades. Slavery is a very big subject. I have in my home an entire bookcase of books about slavery in various parts of the world and various times of history. And the sad fact is that slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. And even the Western Europeans had vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere,
yes,
but not in Western Europe itself. And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth, and between and cross-hauling, as they say in the railroads, because the number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them. Here we have intellectuals who can imagine a different history from the rest of the world, even though it's so similar to the rest of the world.
Let us not indulge in the simplistic notion that slavery is a uniquely Western outrage, nor that it is some historical aberration that befell only one race or one nation. On the contrary, slavery has been woven into the fabric of all societies at virtually all times. We see it in the ancient world, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in the Americas, and even in Western Europe until quite recently. The notion that black people started slavery is neither original nor accurate, but it does serve as an example of how historical myopia and moral posturing can combine to warp our understanding of the past and blind us to the present. Everywhere one looks, one finds human beings exploiting, subjugating, and trading other human beings. It is a universal dilemma, a perennial temptation, and a stain on every civilization that has succumbed to it. We begin with Adam Smith's observation, made in the very year that the United States declared its independence, that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. We must then ask, what did Smith really mean? He did not mean that the Europeans never benefited from the labor of enslaved people. He meant that within the boundaries of Western Europe itself, approximately, there were no formal institutions of slave labor. By contrast, Europe reveled in profiting from the enslavement of Africans in its colonies, while maintaining the veneer of civilized society within its own borders. The ships might have set sail from Lisbon or Liverpool, but the brutality of the Middle Passage and the plantation fields were offstage, hidden behind a veil of separation. That was how the economics of slavery could coexist with a self-congratulatory morality, one that celebrated freedom at home while endorsing enslavement abroad. Yet the simple fact remains, Europe did indeed have vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere, and not an insubstantial number of white Europeans were themselves enslaved by the Barbary pirates in North Africa. According to some historical estimates, the Berber corsairs took in excess of 1 million white Europeans into bondage over the centuries, a number that at its peak even rivaled the African slave trade to the Americas, who now calls for reparations from the descendants of North Africa. Wherever the tearful editorials and the impassioned congressional hearings, one finds none. Because one thing is abundantly clear, reparations based on slavery cannot be consistently or fairly applied across the historical record without condemning the entire human enterprise to paralyze itself in the quagmire of guilt, grievance, and respectable recrimination. If we were truly to try to make reparations based on the full and universal history of slavery, it would indeed be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth between and across Holland, to borrow the railroad's phrase. Imagine a world in which the descendants of white Europeans who were enslaved in North Africa demanded payment from the descendants of the world's Arab, Berber, and Ottoman powers. Imagine if the descendants of the African petty kings who sold prisoners of war into transatlantic slavery demanded payment from their own descendants. Imagine if the descendants of the Aztec, Inca, and Maya rulers, who themselves used captives as human sacrifices and laborers, demanded reparations first from each other, and then from the Spanish and the Portuguese, who participated in those earliest systems of bondage. Indeed, the complexion of this entire debate would change if we were forced to confront the global reality that slavery is not a moral legacy belonging to one corner of humanity, but a universal failure of morality and self-restraint. Yet nothing of the sort happens. The reason is obvious. No society or tribe or nation has the moral authority to claim a monopoly on victimhood when the record is replete with so many perpetrators and so many victims across every conceivable line of ethnicity, religion, and geography. If we restrict our judgment to the Atlantic slave trade alone, we engage in selective moralism. If we expand our field of vision to include all human slavery, our outrage becomes diffuse and our appetite for reparations becomes ungovernable. That precisely is why few are brave enough to pursue reparations consistently across the board. The perfect is the enemy of the good, but indeed the unachievable is the enemy of pragmatic justice. Whenever we hear a call for reparations based solely on the transatlantic African slave trade, especially when it is directed primarily at white Europeans or their descendants, we must ask, by what moral logic do we single out one instance of a universal phenomenon? Why do we not demand reparations from every society that engaged in slavery? Why do we exempt ourselves and our allies? The answer, of course, is that we do so out of convenience or sentiment or political calculation. But convenience, sentiment, and political calculation are not the same as justice. Indeed, the moment we elevate convenience over principle, we set in motion a process that cannot be contained. The moment we use selective outrage to validate our own self-esteem, we invite counterclaims that by their very scale defy any meaningful redress. But let us return to the bigger picture. Slavery on every continent has been a product of the same fundamental human failings: greed, ambition, arbitrary authority, and the dehumanizing impulse to reduce other people to mere property. Each culture that practiced slavery did so under the pretext of necessity or divine sanction, but in every case the result was the same: moral corruption, social stratification, economic distortion, and cycles of violence that echoed for generations. Yet in most cases, societies eventually found the moral courage and practical means to abolish slavery, not because they were coerced by a distant government, but because abolitionist arguments prevailed over vested interests. In Great Britain, for instance, the abolitionist movement harnessed the power of moral suasion, economic argument, and political organization to end the trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in 1833. It was not the descendants of slaves who forced Britain's hand. It was a small group of activists who discovered that moral clarity could overcome economic inertia. That is the pattern one sees repeated across the Western world. Ironically, however, in the very places where one would expect the fiercest commitment to abolition, for the moralists who condemn the transatlantic slave trade, and that moral clarity vanishes when the ledger of historical guilt grows too large to be settled. Even more revealing is the tendency of certain intellectuals to use reparations as a convenient club against their own society. By casting a guilty glance at white America, they manufacture a grievance that unites disparate constituencies, academic progressives, identity politics zealots, left-wing activists, under the banner of righting historical wrongs. But this tactic relies on a double standard, fixating on one group's participation in one era of slavery while ignoring others' participation across time and geography. In effect, it weaponizes partial history against whole peoples. This is not moral rectitude, it is moral opportunism. When white liberals champion reparations for slavery, they do so not out of genuine compassion for descendants of slaves. If that were their goal, they would be organizing mutual aid societies, job training programs, educational scholarships targeted to underserved communities, and local mentorship initiatives. Instead, they lobby for costly tax and transfer schemes that do little to change the fundamental incentives that keep people mired in poverty, or worse, encourage victimhood as a substitute for personal responsibility. Even more insidious, this posture allows white liberals to claim moral superiority without having to sacrifice anything of substance. The policy seems generous on the surface, but it actually does little for those it purports to help, and often ignores the real obstacles to upward mobility: failing schools, single-parent households, crime-ridden neighborhoods, and a dearth of economic opportunity. Meanwhile, when some black conservatives point to cultural norms such as high rates of out-of-wedlock births, father absenteeism, and educational underachievement, they are branded as traitors to their race. They are accused of blaming the victim, even though the statistics cannot be denied. The left prefers a narrative that is more comforting. If only all white people would pay up, the suffering would end. But that is a fantasy. The problems that plague poor and working class black communities today, crime, family breakdown, substance abuse, educational deficits, do not spring from slavery in 1863, but from local conditions and cultural values that have evolved since emancipation. One need only consult the data to see that black households with intact families enjoy better economic outcomes, higher educational attainment. When multiple national studies find that the majority of black college students come from middle or high-income families, it becomes clear that class matters as much as race. Yet if facts stand in the way of the grievance industrial complex, those facts simply get ignored or denied. Instead, the dominant narrative insists that all black suffering can be traced back to slavery, an ilsome narrative that conveniently absolves individuals of responsibility. But if slavery is the root of all contemporary disparities, then by that logic, every single aspect of present-day life must be filtered through the lens of 160 years ago in the South. If that seems absurd, it is because it is absurd. The first step in any rational policy conversation is recognizing that while historical injustices demand moral remembrance, they do not automatically furnish a moral compass for every present dilemma. Let us be equally clear. During the era of chattel slavery in North America, white slaveholders bore much of the moral blame. They treated slaves as commodities, subjected them to unimaginable cruelty, and deprived generations of a stable family life. That legacy cannot be minimized. But neither can we wipe the slate clean for other historical actors. Indeed, far more whites died defending the Union in the Civil War than died in any single battle of the Revolution. Nor did the end of Reconstruction in the South occur because of white complicity alone. Factional strife among black politicians, the corrupting influence of carpetbaggers, and the economic devastation wrought by post-war breakdown all contributed. Complex social phenomena emerge from multiple causes, not a single one. We must also remember that slavery was not abolished by force of law alone. It was abolished because vast numbers of people embraced a more elemental truth, that no human being should be owned by another. That moral revolution took root long before Harriet Tubman's countless rescues or Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It germinated in the hearts of countless Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, and other religious activists who regarded slavery as an affront to God's design. Their dissent was often mocked as irrational idealism, but it ultimately prevailed because moral clarity can be far more powerful than political pragmatism. As Lord Acton famously said, liberty is lost through liberty, cautioning that unrestrained power corrupts. Even the power to enslave can be undone by the power of. Today, a new moral revolution is underway, one that too often replaces conscience with conformity, critical thinking with ideological shorthand, and gratitude for progress with a new perpetual grievance. To claim that black people started slavery is not just a provocation. It is a straw man that distracts from the real work that must be done. America's future does not lie in interminable debates over reparations, but in pragmatic reforms that expand opportunity, strengthen families, and foster accountable communities. If we truly wish to uplift those left behind, we should invest in better schools, reform broken welfare systems that disincentivize work, and encourage cultural norms that prize marriage, fatherhood, and neighborliness. To measure the progress of black Americans, or any group, against a yardstick of historical victimhood is to condemn them to stagnation. Prosperity does not flow from guilt payments. It flows from self-reliance, innovation, and the willingness to embrace change. We need not deny the horrors of the past in order to confront the challenges of the present. We must simply recognize that the world changed long ago, and that many of the most promising solutions have less to do with reparative payments and more to do with unleashing the creative energies of every individual, regardless of ancestry. Yes, there will always be hardship and injustice in human affairs, but let us not mistake every hardship for systemic oppression, nor let us mistake every call for fairness as a demand for wealth transfers. These are two very different things. Societies can recognize historical wrongs without erecting perpetual entitlements. They can memorialize past injustices without letting moral outrage become a permanent political platform. At the end of the day, the strength of a society is not measured by how many people it labels as victims, but by how many people it empowers to transcend circumstance. True justice is not the endless compensation of every misdeed with an equal payment. It is the creation of a system in which every person, regardless of skin color, is free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, secure in the knowledge that their own effort and virtue matter. I conclude with a simple admonition. Let us study history to learn from it, not to live in it. Let us honor the memory of those who suffered, not by litigating grievances, but by building institutions that allow all to thrive. And let us replace the politics of resentment with the politics of hope, guided by the enduring truths of human nature. For if we fail to do so, we condemn ourselves not only to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to magnify them. But if we succeed, if we learn that the most powerful form of reparation is not a check, but an opportunity, not a wound reopened, but a wound healed, then we will truly have moved beyond the shadows of our history into the light of a better tomorrow. Thank you.